Welcome back to another episode of Suckcessfull, the podcast.
I'm one of your hosts, Blake, and joining me,
I'm one of your other hosts, Justin.
And this is the podcast all about the not so subtle truth about success and
the art of sucking less in pursuit of it. Let's not waste any more time and get right to the show.
Well, Justin, I want to welcome you back because you just got back in town from being overseas. So welcome back and welcome back to our podcast.
Blake, thank you so much. It's great to be back. And more importantly, it's great to see you and it's great to be stateside. I also apologize for you and our audience, everything. I was gone for almost exactly 2 weeks. So thanks for putting up with that.
No, of course. No worries. And going overseas is an exciting trip. So as much as you can take the opportunity, I say always do it.
Absolutely. And it was fun because I got in at like 7 a.m. and Bill didn't land till I think 10 or something like that. I waited for him and then we met up and then we went through customs. And I'll tell you, it is so different now. You don't even need passports anymore. So like you literally like to check in, you go to customs in the UK and literally all you do is you stand there, show your face and they let you through. There's no paperwork. There's nothing. And then when you get on the plane, they just literally, you scan your face. There's no boarding passes anymore. It was the weirdest thing.
Wow, that's crazy.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah. I bet that speeds the process up though, because didn't it used to take a long time?
Oh, it sucks. And it was just the craziest thing. When you go to like check in, they literally, you stand on this thing and they like scan your face and it pops up and it's like 31K or whatever your seat is. It was crazy. It was weird. It's really cool, but it's weird like how far. I mean, I went overseas just a few years ago and it was not like that. Like that's radical change in a very short period of time.
Well, it seems like technology is really moving forward at all speeds on all sides lately.
Yeah. It does. And I think that brings us kind of a good segue here to what we're going to talk about today, which is, can technology be a partner? And how do you be a better partner in general to your partners? That was a lot of partners.
I love that. I love that. And I think it's something that everybody struggles with, whether it is picking the right technological partner, as you say, or it's even relationships or your career and picking business partners. I feel like this is something that everyone ends up struggling with. Everyone has to learn certain lessons with, and sometimes have to learn more than once.
And sometimes you never learn it.
True.
It's true. So I've met a few people in life that literally, you know, those people that always fall for the same relationship wise, and you're like, that they're a horrible match. Or they're like, no, this is the one. You're like, I don't think so. Some people just never catch on. I think it's important, one, that we realize it, and two, to talk about it openly. Let's give some examples of things that either we've personally been through or witnessed in our careers, that things to do and things not to do. Does that sound good?
That sounds good. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. It was interesting because it's a partnership company. It's just a really fascinating company overall, but it was an interesting experiment in supporting and not supporting each other. So there were two partners that are really supportive of each other and one that's not. And it was just interesting to me over there seeing, building this brand, doing all these things, and then all of a sudden, like, someone not being supportive of something. And there's not really a reason for it. It was more like either it was ego driven or it was fear or it was something else, because when there's change involved, one of the partners didn't take that change so well. It was it was kind of sad to watch because you could see the company turning around, doing great stuff. And at the same time, you could feel the stress at the upper level management where people weren't sure who to go to. They weren't sure what was really going on. It's a time that honestly, I think should be celebrated because they've survived this really cool, tough period, but they come out of it really, really strong. And to see a partner that didn't support the others was the weirdest. For me, it was actually the first time I'd ever seen something to that degree where, yeah, when times are tough, it's natural sometimes that people get defensive or whatever, but times weren't that, like, they're getting better. And all of a sudden, one of the people decided to step kind of back a little bit and create a lot of friction for just friction's sake, not for any good reason. I'm still struggling with all the answers and how to handle it, but it's just been a very weird situation to go through. And so I wanted to kind of, one, share it, and two, talk through it.
I've experienced similar situations and I have witnessed a lot of those types of situations. And I think a lot of times it has to do with expectation. There's I guess, an imbalance of expectation between the partners. And what's frustrating about that is you would think a lot of communication would solve that. But actually, in my personal experience of going into business very young, I went in very young and naive. We had too many partners, but we had all these conversations about how we wanted to run the company, how we wanted to proceed, who was going to do what. And at the end of the day, there was a difference in expectation in terms of being a partner and being on the executive level versus being an employee. And so sometimes that's the issue. Other times I've come to find that it's the expectation of who's getting, I guess, like the front end of the reward, so to speak, and who's getting the credit has been a problem too. I've had partners where we do a project together, they completely disassociate themselves. Of course, when the project does well, all of a sudden they want to come back and be like, well, I did this thing. Well, you took your name off and you disassociated. So no, I didn't call you when the festival came calling me.
And they're stunned, right? They kind of are like, wait, what? How could you do that to me?
Yep. And there's a lack of accountability there where, oh, well, it's your fault. Well, that's interesting. Okay, sure. We'll go with that one. Argue with you on that.
I think you're 100% right. And it's funny, right? Because you look back and we're laughing about it now. But at the time, you're not laughing, right? You're kind of like, WTF, what are you doing? First of all, you nailed the expectation piece, which often gets lost in these conversations, right? Because you assume people are aligned, especially when you're looking out for the business or your clients or whatever, and you assume everyone else is on board with you. And when you find out that they're not, you're kind of like, wait, what? And then all of a sudden, I find myself asking questions like less productive questions, reactive questions like, why would they think that? When in reality, what I should be doing is finding a way around that, getting around that roadblock rather than trying to get in the mindset of someone who's irrational is always the dumbest thing to do, because irrationality is not only lack of alignment, but it's so unpredictable. There's really never a solution for it. So what I'm going to do this time in particular is get around it by just laying out facts and saying, this is what we're doing, either on board or off, and keep plowing forward rather than play the emotional game, which is horrible. First, it sucks in dating. And two, it's even worse in business.
I agree with that. And unfortunately, it's very easy to fall into the emotional category where you're just arguing, kind of, not think of arguing, but because you kind of do it because you want answers. But to get back to that irrational part, if you are arguing with somebody or trying to get to the root of a problem with somebody who's not self-aware, oftentimes they're not even aware of the problem, or it's stemming from a place that they are maybe acknowledging, but they're not willing to actually do the work or to make the change in order for that to be a different story.
Blake, I'm going to say this right now because I don't know, maybe we're 10, 12 minutes in and I haven't done it for a couple weeks, but knowledge bomb was dropped twice in a row from you. And I think that's really, really important because the aspect of are you aware or unaware gets lost also, I find, when you're going through it personally. Like retrospectively, it's easy to see that. But I found it hard sometimes because I get paid to give advice. So giving advice is usually easier than taking your own advice sometimes, because in the process, you get lost in it. I do believe hindsight's always 20/20, but I think understanding some of those patterns and getting ahead of it, when you see these patterns emerge, is not accept it, but realize it's a pattern and break it.
I agree with that. And it really is learning to break the pattern. And so I always talk about this a lot. A lot of people think that karma is some sort of cycle that is based on reward or punishment, when actually it's cause and effect. And so in order to break a karmic cycle, you have to learn the lesson, but then also apply it. The problem I see is that a lot of people are acknowledging the problem in terms of they're like, oh, this is my problem, or I'm this way, or I have a tendency to do that. But then they don't do anything different. Well, then you're not applying it. So then you're going to repeat the cycle. So people who are like, oh yeah, I have a tendency to date people who are unavailable. And then they keep dating people who are unavailable. Well, you didn't apply the lesson, so you're going to continue repeating it.
But I think it goes back to your original point, though. Are they aware or not? And I think that at that stage, it becomes so habitual. They get lost that it's even a pattern. They don't see it as a pattern, and they see it more as familiar, because people love things that are familiar. And your example of karma. So for me, I've actually never heard it broken down like that. I think it's beautiful because I usually do think of it as like risk, not risk and reward, but you do a good deed, you get a good deed back. But I love the idea of it being a lesson and applying that lesson. I think it's much more profound and much more, I think, appropriate a lot of the time. Because if it's really just as simple as, do you do something good and you should expect it back, I think that's a false narrative. And what really needs to happen is not only learn the lesson, but do good things to do good things.
Well, it's interesting. What you just said reminded me of something that I was talking about earlier today, which I didn't plan on bringing up. But on one of my other channels, I was posting a quote that I had talked about the other day, which has to do with reciprocity. So a lot of people think that because the law of attraction states like attracts like, what you put out is what you receive. People think that if they give more in particular relationships, that is the same case when it comes to people. But the thing that people forget is that each person has a choice of whether to give or receive, and the intention of that giving and receiving is also a choice. And because there's a choice involved, then that's not inherently true that what you give is what you get, because it's a decision on the other person and on you.
That's really interesting. That, again, Blake, I mean, we're recording 11:30 your time, 10:30 mine, and I feel like we're getting into something really deep and poignant here and powerful, and I love this. So I think the idea of free will, the choice, is critical in those decisions. And the idea of going in, and I think goes back to what I was talking earlier in terms of the irrational side of it. If you're playing with two rational beings and you're using facts, figures, or at least clear rational thought to decide something, the outcome is usually fairly predictable. But the irrational piece of it is going back to kind of what you were stating a second ago in terms of if it's irrational, you have no idea what the reaction is going to be. And so the whole idea of it being reciprocated in some way or the intention of it being received, none of that matters. It's 100% emotional and it will never get returned the way you put it out there.
I agree with that. And what's interesting too, to kind of at that point of like giving and receiving and putting out and receiving, I got into an argument the other day with somebody who was like, well, I used to look for reciprocity in relationships, but then I stopped doing that because I found myself tailoring or tapering my emotions or actions according to the other person. And I said, well, that's the problem though. When you're looking for reciprocity in a relationship, it shouldn't be because you're trying to react to the other person. It should be because you're looking for the balance of energy. So think of it more then as making sure that you are feeling like things are happy, positive, reciprocal, rather than reacting to what the other person is giving you. That's not the point. The point is to pay attention to how you feel in the relationship, because if you feel positive, likely the energy is balanced. If there's negative feeling when you're with somebody, then likely the energy is imbalanced in some way. Look for the imbalance and you'll get to the root of the problem. And they were like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And I said, well, it's because you're still basing everything off of your validation or lack of validation from another person. It's not about the validation from the other person. It's about you. And I think ultimately when you're picking partners, a lot of people react a lot in relationships. They react to how the other person makes them feel. You shouldn't be reacting to how someone makes you feel. You should be feeling happy and such by yourself. It's when somebody adds value to your life, when they add it through the way they make you feel, the way they support you, the way that they help you or take action. That's the important part. It's that is the reciprocity. That is the equal balance of energy.
That's awesome. I love that. And I think that the idea there is so important. One, that external validation is a losing game every time. And especially for someone that, especially when I was younger, need a lot of external validation because I was insecure and everything else. It was always a losing game and it became even more stressful. That's a constant struggle there. The other side of it is too, that the idea of a partner, it should be a magnification of your feelings and not a supplement for it. And so like the whole idea is like one of the things I try to be magnetic.
You just got one. You just got
Yes.
a knowledge bomb.
Yes, finally, I was waiting for one. Thank you. See, we're 2 for 2. High five. I think it's so important here because you want people around you that magnify the expectation that you want and the feelings that you want. But if you're looking for them to reciprocate your word reciprocity here, all those things, that's a false narrative too. What you're looking for is someone to not only balance it, but to provide that extra little boost that you need sometimes. A great example of this was on this last trip. We were staying at someone's house and their parents were there the first and second to last night we were there. And it was so funny to me because they're kind of stodgy and they're old school British. They hate change. Like one of them, the wife had never left their little village ever. When I say little village, like maybe 1,000 people, it's very tiny. Anyways, and yet they were the most warm, loving, and we had the most fun laughing all night because what they wanted to do was learn about what life was like and the differences between us and the United States. And it was so much fun. And we had such a blast doing it. And what I found there was it wasn't the idea of opposites attract or the polarization of feelings. It was more that we found balance between each other and found joy in each other just being together and finding that opportunity to connect rather than be divisive. And it was awesome. Like it was so much fun because they warned us when we got there. My parents are very standoffish. They don't usually like outsiders, whatever. And I will tell you, they were so warm to me and to Bill. They were so wonderful. And I honestly think they're beautiful people. But it was such a cool experience to have kind of the tide turn because a lot of the time when I always find myself putting blinders on. When someone says, beware of that person, I have my blinders on. But what I'm learning is their perception doesn't have to be my reality. I should always go in open and be the best version of myself and share that with others rather than go in guarded and afraid.
I agree with that. And I think that gets into being complementary. When you're looking for partners, regardless of whether it's romantic, career, friends, even whatever, you're looking for that complementary aspect. A lot of people get caught up in the whole idea. I hate like some of the constructs we have specifically about relationships, like the whole idea of like, oh, you need your partner to complete you. Always makes me like roll my eyes. Ugh, I hate when people say that because it's such bullshit. Oh, I'm sorry. I need you to be complete. No. And if that's what you're looking for, oftentimes that's so based out of reality that like it's never going to work.
No.
Because it be about completing each other and it shouldn't be about being complete opposites of each other. You can have completely different viewpoints and completely different opinions on things, but have the same goal and be in alignment and be complementary of each other. That is how it works. Like you end up moving forward and being able to work together, even if you are complete opposites in a lot of ways, as long as the alignment to the end goal is the same and you're working together, not against each in a complementary way. That's how you can make things work. But I don't think it's based off of completing each other, or people think that when I say alignment, a lot of the times in my other content, they're like, oh, we have to be identical. Well, you don't want to be identical because you're not perfect and nobody is. You need somebody who's going to push you outside of your comfort zone in a good way. You need that other person to give you different perspectives. You need that complementary piece. Focusing on that is one of the most important things that you can do, is to focus on being complementary and then moving forward with the same goals.
I love it. And I think that's the piece, especially when you talk about partnerships, that is so important, is that it's less about, do you see the world the same way? It's less about your beliefs. It's more about what are you striving for? That's the unificating factor. That's that piece that I think we often get lost in. We love people to look like us and to act like us, but in reality, none of that truly matters. When we talk about diversity, that's the piece that adds, creativity and stuff. It's less about skin color and beliefs in terms of religion, all that kind of stuff. It's the idea of providing a new input with the same goal in mind at the end. Because if you don't have the same goals, it's never going to work. It's going to be a friction point because your alignment's off. It's less about the idea of finding, and I actually find this all the time. Like my daughter and I are so similar. It's really funny. I love her to death, but she pisses me off very quickly. And I realize because she's so similar to me, and what I find is that it's easier to get along with people that are less like me than sometimes more like me. And I think that's a great example of a partnership here. And the idea is if your goals aren't aligned, you're off, but also you want someone who's not exactly like you, because the whole idea of when you said a second ago, like completing you don't want someone
See, I can't even, you even said it out of context. I'm like, huh.
It makes my eyes roll too, because you are enough is where I always start with too. You're enough. And people lose the sight of that, and they rely on so many other inputs to validate them. When in reality, it's about alignment towards the goal. Where are you going? What do you want to do? And if you're both aligned, that's when magic happens. That's when you can break through any barrier on earth because you have the power of unification. When you're not united and you're divided in terms of how you're going to do this, what your end goal is and where you're going to go, 9 times out of 10, it fails. Sometimes you get lucky. I'll give you a 10% success factor, but mostly you're going to fail in that kind of relationship and that kind of partnership. My first kind of piece of advice here is it's less about seeing the world the same way. It's less about where you're from. It's less about all these other things that we consider important. It's more about where do you want to go? And if you're aligned on where you want to go, like for instance, when Blake and I first met, we hit it off pretty close. It wasn't like we first met each other. It took like 10 times to kind of get to the root of it. It was pretty much instantaneous. It's because we had kind of the same drive in life. We had kind of the same focus on where we're going. We knew what we wanted. And it's refreshing to be around those people too, because I mean, you saw the world very differently than me, but we get along very well and we have the same goal in mind. And that's what helps unify us. And I think that's where, when you're looking for a good partner, whether it's in business, whether it's relationship, whether it's in even getting along with your family, start with alignment in terms of where you want to go or what you're really doing. And that's where that creativity and cool, like that great kind of hug feeling that you're looking for comes from.
Well, and I think it's important to say too that you want to stick to your authenticity, but when it comes to the differences between people, you should, if you are in alignment, be able to respect each other's differences of opinions and different viewpoints and things.
Yes.
Oftentimes people, especially people who get into toxic relationships and stuff, have a tendency to overlook that part. Oh, well, we're just different. We just have difference of opinion. Is it that you have difference of opinion, or is it that you don't value the same things and you can't respect each other's values? That's a totally different thing. Sometimes those discussions kind of don't even happen between people because they don't teach that stuff in school. You know, I mean, even when it comes to business partners, it's interesting because there's somebody that I knew who is very successful, and they have this whole persona of being a husband and wife who are big in the film industry.
Okay.
The husband is supposed to be the producer, the executive producer, the one who handles all the finances because he used to work on Wall Street. The wife is the one who's supposed to be creative, does the writing, the directing, does the artsy stuff, right? They have this persona for years. I mean, they really play it up. Well, when I got to know them, I was like, okay, well, I need to talk to him because I need to learn more about like the finance side of things. So one day I sat him down, I started asking some questions, and his response was, well, actually, I have no idea because I don't know any of that. And I was like, wait, what? And he goes, yeah, she does all of that. I'm just the face for it. And I was like,
what?
Oh, what? How does that work? And essentially, long story short, the impression that I got from what he said about it was that he didn't know anything about the industry, hardly at all. He learned everything he knew from her, and she had him be the face because she had this internal thing about being a woman in the industry, and she thought it would make her more successful. So this entire time, the whole persona they put out, which is totally crazy to me, that's the persona, is it's still that he does all the finance, blah, 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 and then she's a creative, when actually she supposedly does everything herself, and then he just helps. And I was like, that's a very weird sort of dynamic.
That's horrible.
Yeah. And I was like, so really, it made me question like how much weight he pulls, how equal is it? You know, he could be very helpful, but to me, that's not an executive producer. That's like an executive assistant. Not to be an asshole, but like, if we're getting into specifics here, that's kind of what it is. So I'm like, So it's dynamic. It's a weird way that they structure their companies. And it's been like that ever since. And that just totally threw me for a loop. And ever since then, it's gotten me to thinking about the perception people have of partnerships and the reality of it. And the whole idea of like, where does the line get drawn between that perception and the reality? And that was probably the weirdest out of all of the different partnerships in terms of business. That's the weirdest one to me.
That's a weird one. That is a really weird one. And it's strange to me that it survived this long. It's one, I think that goes to that 10% kind of rule we talked about a second ago. And it also goes back to what we talked about a few beats back in terms of you're always going to need help in life, but you need to be self-sufficient in terms of you need to understand that you are enough and stand by that. And to have someone else kind of buttress you from the fact that I'm not secure enough that I need to have someone else represent this because I'm too afraid that's really weird. And this last, when I was, it's fun when you're out there because you get to meet new people. And one of the people that I met is recently engaged. And so I was asking her, I was trying to find some sort of commonality to bond over first. And I was like, so tell me, how'd you guys meet? All this sort of stuff. And she goes, well, I really hated him at first. And I'm like, well, how many love stories I don't know if that's boding well for this. She goes, well, but he kind of wore me down over a year. And I'm like,
oh, that's terrible.
That's horrible, right? And then she started smiling and she goes, but it'll work out. And I'm like,
Is it
What?
though?
That,
I don't know.
yes,
Ooh.
and that's exactly what I did. And, I'm unfortunately, I don't have a poker face. So I know I was like, like what the, what the heck are you saying? I walked away from that conversation going like, because I always relate things to movies. Do they write movies about this stuff? Is there a happy ending here? There's never a happy ending when like, you know, he kind of wore me down over time. That's not the love story they write about in Hollywood or anywhere else. It's no one wants that story. So it makes me think, well, then there's probably not the right story. I don't know why people settle for that. It always makes my brain turn a lot because I don't settle that way. I never have. And so it's very odd for me to find people that do. It like blows my mind every time because I'm always like, just why? And I think it's so weird because then the opposite is true and they wonder how I can be me. And it's very strange dichotomy. And I think that's a good example of not ever being aligned. I can't relate to that. I'm always going to think those decisions are weird. Let's say that I was dating someone like that. It would never work out for me because let's say we do get married or whatever. I'd get divorced at some point in time because we would have no commonality after a certain point. And what you need is that bonding of some kind. And if you don't have that bond, and again, anyone out there in a relationship and you started out and it starts out with they wore me down, that's probably a bad sign.
Yeah, that's horrible. I mean my face when you were telling that story. I feel like I would be like,
Yeah. You
but
cringe, right?
yeah. Ooh. I mean, I will say, I think that part of all of that has to do with boundaries. A lot of people, especially if you're brought up a certain way, you don't understand healthy boundaries. You don't even recognize what healthy boundaries are. And that makes it difficult to not trauma bond. So you were talking about bonding, but
Ooh,
severe, it
trauma
needs to be
bond.
it needs to be positive bonding. Trauma bonding is when you essentially get into negative cycles. And what happens is, and this is like fascinating because now we're getting into the science part. When you are in negative toxic relationships that have high highs and low lows, your brain releases certain chemicals in your brain when certain things happen that make things feel 10 times stronger than they actually are. So what happens is you get addicted to the high highs and the low lows of the relationship to where you don't recognize anymore necessarily that it's a toxic situation. And you get into this cycle where you get comfortable and it gets familiar and it becomes habitual. And what's interesting is what people forget about change is even if it's a positive, welcome change, it's always going to be a little uncomfortable because you're having to change the way that you are doing things, the way you're thinking about things, the way you're reacting, the way you feel about it. Even when you are moving into a more positive space in any change, not even just relationships, there's going to be a little bit of like, this is uncomfortable. I don't know. Even if you're welcoming that change, even if it's a good change, because it's simply different. And so when you're in relationships, you're in partnerships, when you're moving forward with that energy of wanting to be in union, whatever your reason is, you need to pay attention to what kind of bonding it is. If you are being attracted because of the negative aspects of things, that's a trauma bond. That's not a real relationship and that's not real love.
I never have thought about it that way, that it is an addiction. That is really crazy. Like, I think it's a really, really important point there that it's easy to get addicted. Like, again, I can't relate to that stuff, but I understand the methodology behind it. I get the theory and I get the science behind it because there are certain things that I'm addicted to. There are things out there that for me, like being around the ocean is crazy. I get like a huge endorphin rush being there. I just feel like I'm home. I get that like kind of comforting feeling. And then there's also people though that you get around that I get that feeling too. And it could be sometimes strangers. It can be people that I've known for a long time. And that to me that's a very addicting feeling. Being on stage for me is crazy. I would definitely call it an addiction where like I'm that type of person when I'm on stage, I'm on. And when I come off, I'm a totally different person. My brain shuts down. I don't even remember half the time what I said. Like I'm in this really weird state, but I love that feeling. I call it my crack. That is, if I did hardcore drugs, that would be my drug of choice. And that would be, and I don't know if it's just because of attention, but I also just love being in that room, that feeling that it gets. And I think that is intoxicating. And so when it comes to relationships, I look for things that give me that feeling too, that give me that high. Sometimes it's healthy and sometimes it's not, because sometimes it becomes expected. Like I expect that all the time. And just like most things, relationships, you can't expect it all the time because people are human beings, right? Some days you're going to have a bad day. Some days you're going to be so elated, you don't know what to do with yourself. Some days you want to be hauled away in your room and don't want to see another human being. I think putting a false expectation on that is not helpful, but knowing that you can get that from someone is really important, but don't expect it all the time. What do you think?
I agree. Not everything is going to be consistent in that way because everybody has their off days. Everybody gets tired. There's so many factors.
Yeah.
But one thing that I started doing several years ago that some people are like, oh my God, you're weird. And other people are like, oh, that's brilliant, is I audit my relationships. I have a whole cycle of things that I have broken down in my journal, and I will sit there and be like, yes, no, this, that. And I start auditing the relationship based off of long-term, how have things been over a certain course of time. Now, some people do that for like a year, which I did do for a while, but I found that sometimes a year is too long, especially when you first meet somebody. A year's kind of a long time to, if there's like a lot of red flags and stuff off the beginning that maybe if you're not taking the time to sit down and really think about, you can overlook stuff. Easily. So I have a tendency to do it more often, but essentially the difference between instant gratification and the long-term feeling of the relationship you have to pay attention to. Because for example, you're talking about how there's certain things that you want that sort of serotonin rush and that like rush of dopamine and that excitement and happiness. But then there's times when, say, certain people who have issues with eating healthy, well, they get that from sugar. So they keep eating sugar and then they're wondering why they're gaining weight. Your relationship and your feeling to the specific thing, you have to also get to the root cause. Is it instant outside validation, or is it a real feeling? Because you have to remember that your feelings aren't facts. Your feelings are good indications and they should be taken into account, but they're not facts. You kind of have to pay attention to multiple aspects: how you feel long-term in the relationship, how the balance of energy is. Does this person drain you every time you're around them, or do they get you excited and make you want to do stuff? Do they talk a big game and get you all excited, but then there's any work's involved? Do you find you're the only one doing it? You have to see if the action, the words, and the feelings all align, or if one is higher than the other, and start figuring out, okay, this works for me or this doesn't. Some people, just the emotional support that you get from that person, and sometimes that's enough for the relationship. Other times when, say, it's a business partnership, that's great, but bitch, I need to do some work.
I love you. That was amazing. I need to do some work. And I guess that for me is an area that I personally struggle with on that last piece, because like for me, I want everyone to be available on my time frame. So like if I'm in a creative mood, like a great example would be Kelly. She is structured to the point, like to the minute of her day. And I am more of the like hour kind of person. So if I end early, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. And she is like by the
person.
What'd you say?
I said, and I'm a day person. I figured it out by the day.
See, and that's just 3 people right there. I mean, yeah, you get multiply that by 1 billion. No one's the same. And it's funny because like I'll go in and interrupt her. I'm like, I got this idea. And she's like, at one time she said, stop being a time stealer. And I was like, I'm not a time stealer. Like I'm trying to like help you. But her perception of that and her perspective is because she had a time allotted for a certain task and I was interrupting that. It's very interesting. And so I think in a partnership, it's understanding those boundaries too, because you're not going to think the same. You have to understand and respect that, but also understand sometimes you need that leeway. You need that kind of outlet of some kind. I think that's really important. So when you talk about those kind of, not necessarily boundaries, but I think they're healthy, but also understanding that there needs to be flexibility there. It can't be rigid. Like if you've got, like I look at, just because I happen to be on a plane, like it's terrifying. I took a 787 over and it's weird because the wings start like this. And as you fly, they go up. It's crazy. It's freaky as hell. And it scares the crap out of me because you're like, it shouldn't bend like that. But it's supposed to bend like that. And I think that little bit of friction, that little bit of movement is important in a relationship too, because if you're a fixed wing and you don't move, you're not getting the hydrofoil effect that the others get. I think there's important there where you have boundaries, but you also are flexible in that and you are malleable to the point where you're accepting of different ideas, you're accepting of different ways of doing things. But at the end of the day, it goes back to what we started with, alignment. Because there's a million ways to get to the end result. I try to read as many business books and like I love autobiographies, and no one's the same. Like you never read a story of someone successful that did this, and like prescribed it and this always works out. There's always little meandering things. And it's just like, again, I go back to the movies. There's highs, there's lows, there's arcs, and there's finales. That's everybody. You're going to go through that. And if you accept that as a partner, you can help each other through those times, right? The good times are going to support you. The bad times you're going to support. but you're going to do it in your own way. And you're going to do it in a way that's productive and not cannibalizing each other or cannibalizing the business or cannibalizing your feelings or, whatever it is. There's so many toxic ways to look at this. And if you are feeling that way and you're wondering if you're in a toxic relationship, I'm going to let you know now you are, because the minute you raise that question, you probably are. And that goes with your boss, that goes with your partners, it goes with actual business partners, it goes with friends, it goes with colleagues. If you are questioning what kind of relationship it is and you're worried if it is caustic, if it is something worse, I guarantee you it is.
Colleen Hoover, which is a famous writer, she wrote in one of her books that essentially when you're in a relationship, you have certain parameters and boundaries, right? But when somebody pushes over your limit and you allow it, your boundaries start going like this and they start expanding slowly and slowly without you recognizing until you don't remember where the walls are anymore. It's important that you, with certain things, need to be rigid though. Like, for example, if you're very no monogamous relationship, that's it, and that person's going out and seeing other people, then that's a hard out. There's certain things you need to have hard outs, but there's other boundaries like the one with your wife where she's like, well, I need this time. Don't interrupt me unless it's important type of thing. But then you have something important you need to interrupt. Obviously, she's not going to be like, oh, Justin, we're through. We're getting divorced. Like, so I agree with you. There needs to be flexibility, but there needs to be certain things for the values that you really put as like your top tier values. There needs to be alignment and respect of those boundaries and those values. If the other person can't respect those boundaries and those values and can't be in the same realm with it, with the same goals in mind, then likely you're not going to be able to make it work, regardless of whether it's a healthy or a negative toxic relationship.
Blake, I love it. And I think, I hope our audience today learned a lot today that basically at the end of the day, relationships need to be reciprocal. They should never be parasitic. They should never feel needy. They need to be a true partnership in the sense that you're both giving and taking, that you're both in this to win it and that you're aligned at the end of the day. And if you're ever feeling that you're not, or you're going a different direction, you're probably not in the best partnership. And it doesn't mean give up on it. It means reevaluate and see if you're aligned. If you're not aligned and you can't get aligned, it may be time to call it quits.
Well, I think too, sometimes people forget that relationships take time and investment and respect. And that goes for all relationships. Some people, they meet someone, they hit it off and they think, oh, we can just be business partners. Usually not. Usually there's a little bit more that needs to go into that. And so, for example, I had an ex-business partner. She was very big into restarting a company together, reworking together, doing all this stuff. And I was hesitant because we didn't align before. And so what I did is I created a smaller project to do that didn't have any stakes in terms of if she dropped the ball, it wasn't going to put me out. And that was sort of a test in the sense that it gave us the opportunity to see how we work, if we work better together, if we're in alignment. Long story short, we weren't. She dropped the ball because some people are more about pretending to have all this success, pretending to be successful in the sense of, oh, I want to be an entrepreneur and I want to do this and I want to do that. When at the end of the day, they're more interested in either writing coattails or talking about it and not actually doing any of the things. So if you're not sure, it's good to start just like you start with dating in a romantic relationship. Go on a date in terms of your partnerships for business. And what I mean by that is start with a small project, something that doesn't have crazy stakes. See if they take the initiative. See if they hold their end of the deal. See if the action aligns to the words. And if it does align, then think about moving forward. If it doesn't, then you got your answer.
Blake, I couldn't have think of a better place to end this. You nailed it again. I mean, I don't want to take 2 weeks off again, but I'll tell you right now that you got a lot stored up there. You were prepared today. You came in. I got to tell you, today was a struggle for me because the 6-hour time difference is a lot. And the flight yesterday messed me up and everything else. But I feel reinvigorated today. And I think this is a great example of a partnership that works. This is something I look forward to. I always get annoyed with people that go to work and they're like, oh, another work day. That should be your flag. Like that should be your red flag that there's something off here. You're not aligned. And with that, I want to say, thank you, Blake. And I want to say to our audience, thank you guys so much. Please comment below. Let us know what you think. And more importantly, give us examples of partnerships that have worked for you and things that haven't. Because I think the more we share, the more we talk about this stuff, the better off we all are. And again, it's something we can all relate to, right? We've all been in bad relationships. We've all been in good relationships. Now someone's going to say, I've never been in a good relationship. And I go, well, that may be on you. Like,
Learning and applying. You have to apply the lesson. What is that old saying? Something about insanity. What is it? Oh, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. Is that what it is?
yeah, a different result. Yes, that's exactly right. And I think that is one of those things that gets lost on people in general that we forget. I think it's important that we'll do the same thing over and over again. And yet we do expect a different result. And you're going, but that's stupid. Why would you do that?
Well, Justin, as they say, all good things must come to an end.
Alas, they must. However, this isn't the end because next week, same time, same channel, we drop another episode.
So get excited because we're going to be diving deeper into all the topics of the not so subtle truth about success and
the art of sucking less in the pursuit of it. So join the conversation below and don't forget to subscribe.